Today, our guest is going to talk about codependence recovery for love addicts. So please welcome Shena Tubbs. Hello there.
Hey, Andy. How are ya?
I'm good. It's great to see you, and I'm so glad that you're willing to do this and hop on and tell everyone your thoughts on this topic. So I want to share a little bit about you first, and then we'll dive into some questions. So Shena is a licensed professional counselor and a certified sex addiction therapist candidate in Houston, Texas. She specializes in treating women with intimacy disorders, with trauma, sexually compulsive behaviors, or addictions. And she also is trained in some of the leading models for trauma and emotional regulation, such as EMDR and dialectical behavior therapy. She also hosts a really amazing podcast. It's called Love Junkie, focusing on healing and recovering from sexual addictions and codependency. And she also manages the Black Girls Heal website and group, which is a community focused on offering tools for Black women to heal from childhood trauma, unhealthy relationships, and low self-esteem. So you're up to a lot of stuff over there.
Damn busy.
Busy lady. So why don't we start with just hearing your story? How did you get into this line of work, Shena?
Yeah, so I've been a therapist for about 10 years, and about halfway through my career, I worked at a residential treatment center for co-occurring disorders, so borderline and bipolar and substance abuse addictions. And part of the treatment for these folks was sometimes love addiction or sex addiction. And I remember saying, this is crap. Well, I don't understand why we're doing this, but I kind of half-heartedly would walk people through the steps and talk about it. Then my mother passed away unexpectedly, pretty tragically. And it triggered a huge response in me, sent me to therapy for myself. And lo and behold, my therapist one day said, Shena, do you think maybe you can go to a meeting for sex addicts? And I was like, his name was Tom. I was like, Tom, I'm not a sex addict. Because I would talk a lot about these really unhealthy and toxic relationships that I continue to be in, and pornography addictions, and of course, codependency in my family relationships. And it kept coming up until I started to cross boundaries and lines that I always said I would never do. And then I learned about it, went to meetings, and then found out, oh, okay, this is real. This is very true, right? And so since then, I've just, throughout my career, I started off being maybe more of a generalist and helping everybody and helping some of the more difficult disorders like borderline and things like that. And then just over time, I've just let my passion focus in on women like me who were battling and are battling things that there really isn't a lot of literature about, that there's a lot of stigma about, there's a lot of misinformation about, and just zeroing in on that to help other women get free. So.
Thank you. Awesome. Thank you for sharing. And it is always amazing, right, how we go through our own journeys and then often, right, are inspired to help other people because we've had this experience and, know what's happening and we can share that with others and help them through their journeys. So I love that you're doing that in your work. So let's dive into what codependency is. What does that mean to you?
To me, codependency means an over-reliance of taking care of other people, and that you're not okay unless they're okay, and you're not okay when they're not okay. It's just a lack of intimacy and attachment to yourself.
A lack of intimacy and attachment to yourself. Got it. Right. Thank you.
Yeah, and an over-reliance on other people to define who you are as well.
So what about love addiction? I know that is a specialty of yours. So what is love addiction and what does this have to do with codependency specifically?
Yeah, so all love addicts are codependent, but not all codependents are love addicts. So a love addict is someone, excuse me, I feel like I have to sneeze, so I apologize if I do it in the middle of talking. A love addict is someone who continually seeks love and affirmation from unavailable partners or unavailable situations. So this could be seeking partners who are maybe in other committed relationships, who are workaholics and not able to give them time and affirmation, who may be avoidant and not be able to be intimate and be vulnerable. But the love addict is looking for affirmation from these unavailable people. It's kind of this self-sabotaging pattern where they're trapped in the cycle. And for someone to be a love addict, they will find that this is persistently the type of their relationship that they're in. A lot of times I talk about this and I give the disclaimer that, you know, most people can talk about being in an unhealthy or toxic relationship. Not everybody, but a lot of people can. You know, that person where it's just so hard for you to let go of, and it's hard for you to put up boundaries. But for a love addict, these are the type of people that they consistently are attracted to, or they are in relationships with people who are trying to be connected to them, and they're the ones who are putting up walls and not really interested in going forward. And also one of the key markers of a love addict is in this pursuer distancer cycle is this extreme depression and withdrawal and pain that happens when you think about or when you attempt to try to create boundaries with them, because this person is kind of like your drug, or the relationship is kind of like your drug.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that and honed in on that, because right, it's an addiction. It's a love addiction. So exactly, right. How do you feel when you're in withdrawal from, right, not having that addiction, that person, or setting those boundaries? So
yeah, it's horrible, you know. And like I said, I started off in these residential treatment places with people who had drug addictions, and they would get sober from the drug addiction, and then they would have this untreated sex and love addiction. And so they would get sober, but they would have all these unhealthy relationships. And then when we started to focus on that, they would talk about the pain from withdrawing from love addiction was more painful or as painful as the drug addiction, because really all addictions are just about self-soothing these traumatic wounds, these inner hurts and pain that never got resolved. And so when you take that away and you're just left with yourself, it's excruciating, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm glad you touched on that too, because that is something I've learned in this series, is that, right, the codependency and other addictions underlies so many people who do have alcoholism or drug addictions or things like that. And, you know, covering up that codependency and those fears and all the stuff that goes along with codependency with, you know, right, with a substance. And then, yeah, once you don't have that, then bam, all that other stuff. So yeah, that's really important. So I know in your work, you help women specifically stop these patterns that so many people are in of being attracted to these unavailable partners or these impossible partners, as you put it. So could you talk about that? How do you help women do that?
Yeah, so first I always start with education. Starts with kind of acknowledging what the cycles are and kind of what the patterns are. So we do a relationship timeline, but even before that, or maybe in conjunction with that, we do a family history. And so we talk about mom, we talk about dad, we talk about other important caregivers, and we look at the generational patterns. We look at where the abuse occurred. We look at where emotional neglect occurred. A lot, I would say about half, 50-50. I have some clients who come in and say, yeah, I had a really traumatic childhood. I was abused physically or sexually, emotionally. And I have half clients who said, I had a really great childhood. I have no idea why I'm doing this. And, you know, I had the perfect picture of love. But then when we kind of break down, well, let's talk about, did mom have time for you when she got home from work? Was she working long hours and you kind of had to fend for yourself? She was there and she was active when she could, but there's a lot of time that you were left by yourself. Or was dad very, very strict and he had very high expectations for you, and you as a child internalized that as, oh, he cares for me, but also there was an absence of being able to fail, being able to still be valuable when you are not perfect and when you make mistakes. And so you're also internalizing that I'm only good enough when XYZ happens. And so once we're able to look at those patterns and see what happens in family, we're always, I was going to say usually, but always we're able to say, okay, so you're attracted to this kind of person, which is kind of a representation for mom, a representation for dad, and you're trying to fix this thing that started really early. And then the light bulbs go off and they're like, oh yes, that's exactly what's happening. And so the way to work through love addiction is, one, taking off the mask and giving language to things that have been inexpressible or unable to be explained before. And then once that happens, it takes away the mystery, it takes away the intrigue, and then we can start to do trauma work. We can start on building healthy relationships and rebuilding their self-esteem.
Thank you. Yes, it's amazing how all of that stuff from our past can, right, affect our futures, our present moments, our childhoods to our adult lives, because absolutely it all like trickles in. So it's so important.
Yeah.
So I know you also talk a lot about emotions and how it's really important for people that, especially if they're struggling with codependency, to gain control of their emotions. So can you talk about why that is important, and do you have any strategies on how we do that?
Yeah. So I might kind of remix my answer to your question a little bit, because when I think about emotions and I think about how they get dysregulated with codependency, I guess I'm just kind of tuned into trauma and how it all starts with how we learn how to survive as younger boys and girls based on what happens around us. So if we live in a household that's very chaotic, then we learn different techniques, and whether our emotions are to go dormant and to freeze and to push everything down and to repress and stay small and stay quiet. That could be one extreme, or it could be to get right back with them in the same level and get loud and get expressive, because we learned in that household that if we're not that way, then we don't get hurt and we don't get our needs met. And it's interesting, depending on societal norms or groups that we're in, the first group might be the one that's like the better one, when really what happens when we repress is we start to explode and we get very volatile, right? Like those feelings don't go away, they're still there. So the way to work through our emotions is, one, to become emotionally attuned to what we actually need and what we actually want, right? And so a codependent is someone who's so attuned to other people that they have the absence of needs. I don't really know if I'm happy. If you're happy, I'm happy. I don't really know. Do I have a right to be frustrated? Do I have the right to be angry, right? I mean, maybe your needs are more important than mine. So we start to get clued into what we actually feel, to name emotions, to let go of the shame that we feel the emotions and that we do have needs and we do have wants and that it's okay to have that. And then we work on having a voice to say those things, right? And once I have power, there's no need for me to hide via like my depression and minimizing my feelings and like going low. And there's no need for me to yell and fight and be aggressive and push and pull because I'm able to be balanced and in the middle, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Awesome. Thank you for sharing all that about the emotional end of things. And yes, all of us probably are striving for that balance of, being able to have that balance in our lives. So, you mentioned the other side of things being maybe angry or defensive or whatever. So let's dive into defensiveness. This is a common trait among many of us, including codependent people, right? We tend to defend, something is said to us and we're like immediately defending ourselves or what was said. So how can we be less defensive and less reactive to life, to what people say?
Yeah, I think it's kind of cluing into what our negative core beliefs about ourselves are. So people get defensive for different reasons. So if I say something to someone and they get upset, I could feel like, are you saying that I'm a mean person? Which triggers my negative core belief that I'm bad. So I'm defensive because I feel like you're saying I'm a bad person. Or I can get defensive because I asked for time off from my boss and he said no. And then I feel put upon, I feel unvalued because my whole life I feel like I'm undervalued. I'm always giving and no one appreciates me. And so I get defensive about that. And so again, I think it's connected to figuring out who we are and what we want and also what we actually believe about ourselves. And once I get to that negative core belief, I'm able to start to work on that and reprogram that and give myself new messages about that. And then once I do that, it no longer matters what my boss says to me. If my boss is in a mood or if he does say no to me, then I'm not so triggered and activated and elevated because I feel like he's telling me that I don't matter and the organization can go on without me or whatever the message might be. Or my husband, what was the example I gave? Says I'm a bad person, like, no, I know I'm a good person. I know I'm a good wife. And, maybe this meant something else. Maybe they weren't actually trying to hurt me, but I internalized that because of the lens I'm with. But once I lose that activation, then those things no longer hurt me as much, right? Because I don't need them to tell me I'm good enough. So it's going back to the self-love and getting to know ourselves and loving ourselves. It's so, so hard to love ourselves. It's we're able to give it to everybody else's codependence, but we just feel like we're not worthy. And it's a lie that we really, really have to unplug from and stop feeding.
Right. Yeah, I like that you say stop feeding, because that's really right. It's therein lies the addiction of the lies, of telling ourselves we're unlovable or unworthy or whatever, or bad, So, I think that's addictive too. So I love all of that. Thank you for diving into that. I'd love to chat with you a little bit about adolescents, because I know that you do a lot of work with teens. I think the first time I listened to you and your work was on Brian Pizer's podcast, Codependency No More, and he's actually on this event as well. And I really loved your message, and you were talking a lot about these adolescents. So let's talk about adolescents and codependency, and how do you help them either stop a pattern from starting, in their relationships, like codependent relationships, or, just help them develop healthily so that they don't become codependent as adults.
Yeah. Adolescents, I feel like, are so hard to work with, not because they're teenagers, but because they're still in the household that's triggering the codependency. Right. And so if codependency comes from how we grow up and how we learn whether or not we're valued or not, or if we have parents who are addicts or mentally unstable or workaholics or whatever, and we have to compensate, I could tell a teen all day long, you're worthy and valuable, and they go back home to a household where that's not the truth. So I've found that for it to truly be successful, parents have to be involved. It has to be a family therapy thing. It has to be where mom and dad are open to either enacting changes or validating the experience of the adolescent. In the meantime, if that's not the case, if that's not what I'm working with, especially because a lot of times I worked in the school systems when I was working with teenagers, and parents either weren't available or not interested. It would be planting seeds with them in the same way that I kind of described with women and love addiction and everything, and kind of talking about what's happening in the family, verbalizing that they have permission to not be the parent, to not be the caregiver of everybody there, because a lot of times that's a novel idea. They've never heard that before. They don't even know that's a possibility, and it's mind-blowing to them. And even if the reality is such that with this new revelation, they still have to do these things, otherwise the family doesn't function, now they know there's an alternative. And so I talk with them about that. I talk with them about how it feels, the pressure of being everybody's everything, and how it's not fair. I'm sure that you and your listeners and can probably relate with, sometimes just there's healing and being able to talk about it and not being shamed by feeling this way, by not feeling like you're selfish. And that's really helped the teenagers that I've worked with a lot as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yes. Just being able to talk with somebody, and a lot of times, right, talking with somebody outside of the family who's this safe, mediator kind of person. I remember going to counseling as a kid when my parents split up, and, I had a lot of anger towards my dad and his drinking and all of that. And I remember, like, it felt so good to be able to be in a room with him and this guy, Jim, who I'll always remember, right? He was just such this amazing, I'll always remember this man, and how he helped me, being able to be there and be able to say how I felt,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that was really, a key piece in my development as a 9-year-old, so.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. Thank God for Jim.
I know. Jim Petrie was his name. And I grew up in Boulder, Colorado, and I haven't thought of him in a while, but it just brought that up for me, and what a great stand he took for me and my brother during that challenge. And I'm so glad that we were, able to do it. And I'm so glad that my mom wanted us to do it, because she really got us in the door. So
that's great.
Yeah. Awesome. So, I love that. I mean, that's so important. Think about, obviously, the adolescents, having you and other people to support them in their journey. I can only imagine how supportive that is, for their futures. So, yeah. And again, what you said too about not necessarily, if the parents aren't necessarily supporting that process, at least the kid is going to know that there's some other choice, right? That, you know, they have support and there's a different choice. So thank you
for sure
for that. So let's dive, you know, we talked a little bit about self-love as being, right, this crucial thing in the world of overcoming codependency. So, you know, one of the things I've found doing these interviews is that, you know, codependency isn't just this issue that we have with other, like, partners, let's say. It's an issue we have with ourselves, right? It's an unhealthy relationship with ourselves. So if you had, you know, advice to suggest for people on how to improve their relationship with themselves, what might that be?
Good question. How to improve your relationships with yourself. I tend to be like a give me the steps kind of person. I don't really like talking in generality. So I'm gonna give you steps that may not be foolproof, but it's what I'm gonna give you. So I really like journaling, and I like journaling because there's something about putting things on paper that gets it out of your mind, and it's all running around to where you can see what you actually think and what you actually feel, which builds some awareness about it. I can't tell you how many times I thought that I had clarity about a situation. I know exactly why I'm mad. And then when I wrote it out, I was like, oh, this is actually how I feel. Okay. And then once I'm able to do that, then I'm able to realize, okay, what are these negative core beliefs I actually think about myself, right? And then once I do that, then I'm able to figure out, okay, when did this start? Where did this come from? When was the first time that I remember feeling this way? And then once I'm able to pinpoint who that person is, and I build some awareness, then I can say, wait, that's not my voice. That's the voice of my mother, the voice of my father. What is it that I actually think about myself, or what is it that I actually want to feel about myself? What's the type of lifestyle that I want to have, and what can I manifest? And then I start to write those things down too. And again, it really is about reprogramming ourselves. You know, there's no amount of self-help books and techniques and therapy sessions you go to unless you actually actively outside of it talk to yourself, and you learn to take care of you, and you learn how to self-soothe and give yourself compassion. You know, I think one way to get self-love as well is when bad things happen to us or when we make mistakes, for us to come back and give us the same love and affirmation that we would give our best friend. You know, the whole take yourself out of situations. If my friend Sally were to do this really crappy thing, what would I tell her? Okay, now let me tell that to myself, right? And sometimes you need that in between because we don't really connect. It's so hard to connect to ourselves, right? So I think a lot of self-exploration, talking to ourselves like we're crazy, and it's okay because we're actually talking to us, so we're not crazy. And all love to people who have auditory hallucinations and stuff. It's not supposed to be shaming, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. No, I think that's key, right? And that is, right, building this healthy relationship with ourselves, right? This is the most important in my mind, right? Like relationship, you know, we're going to be with us until the end. So it seems like an important one to, you know, really work through and work on. And I love that you mentioned, you know, talk to yourself like you would talk to a friend, because obviously, right, what would you know, we all probably say things to ourselves that we would never say out loud to anybody else. And, you know, we can be really harmful to ourselves and not nice. So yes, be kind to ourselves. I love it. So, you know, one of my biggest goals throughout this event is to really show people that they can have both a really healthy partnership, a really deep connection with their partner, but they don't have to give up themselves, right? They don't have to have that codependent tendency of losing themselves, losing their identity in this other person. So if you had a piece of advice on how to accomplish this, what would it be?
I think cluing into what you want in life, which could be simply as you writing down the type of boundaries that you want, how you want to be treated in the relationship, how you want to feel in the relationship, and then acting on that. So if I'm having a disagreement with my spouse and I'm feeling undervalued, then I learn to do what I need to do in the moment to take care of me, which is different than attacking and trying to convince the other person to give me what I need. And I feel undervalued, and I'm not going to feel valued until you tell me that you love me. That's not what I mean. Learning again that I'm my own best friend. And so if I'm in a situation where I'm needing something, to learn how to give that to myself versus depending on my spouse to give that to me, which is really hard, especially for those of us who can say, when I met my spouse, I would consider him or her my soulmate. They completed me, and now things are off. And, I don't think anyone was ever meant to complete anyone, right? Because we're human and we're flawed and we're broken. And this is every single person, including the man or woman who was your Superman when you first met them. And so you started off with them on a pedestal with high expectations that was unfair to give them. And so the only person that you're in control of is yourself. The only person who will love you more than anybody else when you get there is yourself, right? And so learning how to be my biggest advocate and my first love is the best thing that I can do for my relationship, because then it takes my partner off the hook, right? And then I can enjoy him, and then I can feel better and not be crabby and not be resentful and all that stuff because you didn't kiss me when you got home from work and you did it yesterday, so that means you don't love me. And he's like, what do you mean? What is happening?
It's like, honey, you're not wearing your Superman outfit anymore.
Yeah, where's your cape? Get your cape, I need it. Yeah.
Oh, that's so good. Yeah, absolutely. And right, like, it's like how often we can place meaning on things that don't mean anything. It's like, okay, yes, this happened. He didn't kiss me. He did kiss me. She didn't kiss me. She did kiss me, or she kissed me in a different way than she kissed me before, or something.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Our minds are very creative,
Yeah. Well, they're creative. Well, I would say that they're functional, right? Because we became codependent as a survival technique, right? We had to survive as younger boys and girls. We had to learn how to navigate what was happening in our households and in our school systems, in our backyards, so that we wouldn't get rejected, so that we wouldn't be isolated, so that we wouldn't be hurt and abused. And so we have that same hypervigilance as adults. We are still scanning the room to see who loves me, who accepts me, who feels like they might need me, who can I save, because that's how I got value before, right? And so these are things that served us when we were younger. We just don't know that we don't need that anymore. And past that, we know we don't need that anymore, but we don't know how to not do that anymore. And it really is like a homecoming to ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you. Let's all come home to ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So we are running low on time, Shena, so I want to make sure everybody gets to know more about you. And I'd love to remind everybody there's a button below this video that takes you over to Shena's website where she has a free gift for you. So could you tell us what that is?
Yeah, so it is a free PDF that's going to talk about 5 steps to break free from love addiction. If you couldn't tell, this is a very layered intimacy disorder that people think they understand. And once they get it, they're like, oh, this is a whole different animal. So I have 5 steps there for you.
See, you are a step lady. See, you said you were all about the steps. There it is.
Yeah, I love it. Give me my process.
I'm with you. It definitely makes it easier to, parse it out into, bite-sized pieces to help us through this process. So I love it. So everybody, please check out Shena's free gift. You just click the button below and it takes you over to her site. So are there any last insights you'd like to leave everyone with before we hop off?
Just be kind to yourself. Again, you are worthy of love. You are your own best friend. You are special just for being you, just for existing, and just remember that.
Awesome. Thank you, Shena. I appreciate you being here and all the work you do in the world.
Thanks,
All right, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in. And here is to our collective journey to self-love and healthy relationships. Bye, everybody. Hey everyone, I just got off another great interview with Shena Tubbs. Shena Tubbs talked a lot about love addiction, right? And the parallels between codependency and love addiction. I thought this was a really great topic to dive into. And one of the biggest take homes for me was when she talked about being defensive. A lot of people have struggles with being defensive, especially when someone in our lives says something that isn't true, or we think they're saying something that's not true, and we want to say, no, wait, like I didn't mean it that way, or here's what I really meant, or here's who I really am, right? This is definitely something I struggle with, and something that I'm trying to become less and less reactive to people when they say things and not always try to defend myself. So, but the big take home was when Sheena talked about how this has to do with our core beliefs. So take a look at yourself. The next time you want to be defensive, what is your core belief around that? If someone is saying something to you, what do you believe about yourself in that moment that makes you think you need to react in that way? Maybe you're thinking you're unlovable. Maybe you're thinking that you're not good enough. Those kinds of core foundational beliefs of being less than. So just taking a look at those, I thought that was really, really powerful and important. Another big take home is, being loving towards ourselves. Once again, this is this massive common thread throughout all these interviews is we need to love ourselves. I think this is probably the most important thing that I'm getting out of this is if we can't love ourselves, it's real hard to, love other people and, live powerfully in our lives if we don't love ourselves. So be compassionate towards yourself. Again, pay attention to what kind of self-talk you have. And if you're being negative towards yourself, remember, you're not going to go say that to your friend, right? You're not going to say these, negative things out loud to your friend that you're saying to yourself. So just give yourself a break, right? Be compassionate towards yourself, love yourself for who you are unconditionally, not just when you're good or not when you're bad, right? These are all things that came from when we were a kid, right? The good and the bad and all of that stuff. So love yourself, be kind to yourself. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in to this interview with Sheena, and I will see you on the next one. Take care.